So Jason, as you know, here at the Riverside Project, we get the opportunity, and you train most of these churches, but the opportunity to work with churches all over the city of Houston who are in Region 6, who to various degrees are saying, hey, we want to be in this space that is child welfare, and we want to serve and vulnerable kids and families, and we want to do that really, really well. And so we work with churches who are saying, hey, we want to be in that and we want to serve. But we have no idea where to start. So working with churches who say, hey, we've been running a parents' night out for 5+ years and we have 4 support groups and all of these things, right? Yeah. And who are saying, hey, but we would love the resources that you have to offer, the trainings, things like that. But one of the most common questions that we get when we are working alongside churches who are saying, hey, I want to be in this space, is that question, hey, how do I start? Some that even leave our church leader training and saying, hey, that was really helpful. I understand the why, and I know like why I'm supposed to be in this, and I have the language now. But yeah, I'm just curious to like, what would you say to a church that's saying, hey, where do I start and how do I even begin bringing this to my church?
Yeah, I'd first say that a lot of times the most passionate advocate in the church that is leaning into this and wanting to see their church more involved runs up into that question of, but I don't even know where to start. And it almost feels debilitating to them, or like a negative, like I haven't figured it out, or this just feels really hard and overwhelming. And I actually like to flip it and say, no, you're at a really exciting place. Like, this is a great spot. Yeah. You're exactly where you should be, and you're asking all the right questions and just honoring them in that, for not just kind of diving headfirst into something that they're not prepared for, they haven't thought through. So really, really good place to be. And a lot of times we say, actually, before we start talking about what this ministry will look like, building a ministry, and I know this is even common language within Riverside, is let's first start talking about community,
right?
Establishing community. And what does that look like? It looks like, let's begin to just take assessment in our church of who in our church, are there families in our church that are doing this already? And to what degree do they feel seen and known and cared for and connected? And maybe we can start there. Maybe there's foster adoptive families. Maybe there's families that are caring for family members, just kind of under the radar. Aunts caring for nieces and nephews, grandmas caring for grandkids. Or maybe there's other aspects of vulnerability and at risk that provide opportunity for us to come and just wrap around relationships and people that are already there. A lot of times the first thought is we look out at our community and our city and go, yeah, we want to get involved. And then we go, whoa, gosh, this is big. What do we do? Well, let's actually just look within the walls of our church and start there.
Yeah, no, that's super good. And I think so often, I mean, and as we talk with churches and even community partners, we see child welfare as outside of the walls of the church. But in actuality, like, there are families, those families are in our churches, right? Like, kind of as you said, I mean, it could be a biological family that just had their children moved, or a kinship family, grandmother who took in, 3 of her grandchildren and things like that. Talk to me about, I think, one, why is the identification process of saying, hey, are there families within the child welfare space that are actually in our churches? Why is that so important? And what have you seen, just kind of as you've gotten to do a lot of this work on a national level and worked with many churches all over the country, what kind of strategies have you seen churches use, or tweaking to forms or things like that, to really identify these families? What does that even look like? Where do you start with that?
And of course, it's not the case that every church, they're immediately going to look around and see, oh, we've got a number of foster families in our church. Some churches are going to look around and say, we are pretty sure we don't have any foster families, pretty sure we don't have any adoptive families. Now what do we do?
Right.
And so actually, some language that we've actually found to be helpful, that we've even heard other church leaders beginning to use, and they've said anecdotally, like, it's actually we've seen more results from it, is broadening the scope a little bit. So an example would be one church leader I remember saying, hey, for our particular context and where our church is and who we know of in our church, rather than standing in front of the church and saying, hey, if you're a foster or adoptive family, if that's something you've done or considering doing, we want to know who you are, and trying to do it that way. They've said, hey, if you are a family in our church that is currently caring for a child that is not biologically yours, we want to know who you are. And they said just in droves, people came out of the woodwork. Just a broader statement where maybe grandma caring for grandkids goes, that's me.
Yeah.
Or even friends of ours in our own neighborhood, for example, that we ran into several months ago on a walk in our neighborhood. And they said, oh my gosh, it's been a long time since we've seen you. We need to update you. They have 3 boys of their own. And then they told us they had recently brought in their 17-year-old nephew. And they said, it's just been really, really hard. And it's like, gosh, there's another example, totally flying under the radar of someone caring for a family member. Sometimes it's a close family friend that's sleeping on the couch, creating space and language that encapsulates all of those. Other very, very practical things for a lot of churches, children's ministry, check-in is kind of a big filter for
it's
families.
Already built into
it's already built in, right? And so
hopefully it's already built in.
Hopefully there's some check-in process. There's something. And to identify who are these families, a lot of churches have found that actually registration or check-in system in a way that's discreet, not like, hey, if your last name is A through Z, you check in here, and a big sign that says, if you have a foster kid, then you check in here. Not like that, but just very discreetly being able to identify families that might have kiddos that aren't theirs, or are there with them temporarily. And then it just creates a little more awareness of who these families are, and then some strategies of how to wrap around and love them.
No, I think that's super helpful. So kind of just taking that question of, hey, where do I start? Maybe even just looking at, hey, well, let's start where we're at in terms of who's in our church, and kind of identifying that in those ways. And so, I mean, we work with some churches who have said, we're going to cast out this whole survey, and we have a survey that they're taking, and just trying to understand, hey, and we talk with churches often of, hey, that do say, hey, we want to do a survey, and that works for their church, great. Some churches say survey would not work here, right? But those who have done things like that are saying, hey, this isn't saying like this is the exact place our church is going to be able to jump in and serve, but it gives you kind of a lay of the land of, hey, this is where maybe we should be headed, or where we should be consider serving. And so how do you kind of like combat, maybe not combat, but like kind of tackle this like tension, maybe if you're a church staff member or like you said, passionate individual or church leader that really wants to be in the space and they want to do it tomorrow. Why is it so important to just kind of pause and just say, hey, because the identification process to me, like thinking like as a church leader, I'm like, that's not like the like, it doesn't feel boots on the ground kind of serving with your hands kind of thing.
Right.
So just why is it like really, really important? And like, how do you kind of, what would you say to a leader that's saying, hey, we really want to start this tomorrow? But
I'd say, appreciate the zeal and fully behind you on the passion. Now, our objective here is to do the right and best things for as long as we possibly can, not as fast as we possibly can. And so there are certain steps that we want to take to ensure that whatever it is that we identify will be kind of a long-term part of the culture of who we are, it's built on something sustainable, it's built on something solid, and that we're really establishing a sense of community and places where people feel prepared and connected to really do this for the long haul, for a long, long, long time. The child welfare space has been largely driven, not exclusively, but largely driven by crisis and urgency. We just need more people faster, and we just need to meet needs faster. And I think where a lot of thinking has come in the last handful of years is, the more faster hasn't really solved a lot of problems. What if what we really need is the right things and the right people longer? And so we're willing to go slower if necessary in order to build out something that's more sustainable. And it's so relationally driven and built. We're talking about real human beings. it's really, really easy to kind of divorce this from reality, and it becomes a cause, and it becomes data, and it becomes catchphrases and language when we talk about caring for vulnerable children and families and serving our city and making an impact. And it's really, really important that we remember these are real life human beings, real people, right, living real lives with real struggles, not unlike any of us. And really what we are engaging in is relationships. That's it. And those take time, and building trust takes time. Whether it's a family that we're serving outside of our church or a foster family inside of our church, churches even need to establish trust with those families, because they are walking through a journey that very few other people can relate to. And if their church were to approach them and say, we actually want to start building out a ministry in our church that serves and supports you, that family needs to know that they can trust that. Because this is a really vulnerable, volatile thing that they're a part of. And the only people that can really be a part of that with them are people that are like committed to doing it well. And so we have to build trust in all aspects of this. And it's never not about relationships.
No, that's really good. And I love what you're saying. I think it's like kind of this long-term kind of game, and it starts with kind of maybe identifying, hey, who are the families in our church, things like that. Is there anything else to a church that would say, hey, how do you start, where do you start, outside of identification?
So some churches could go through that process and say, okay, we feel like we've exhausted all channels of kind of identifying who's in our church, and they'll say, hey, we've actually found some families in our church that we can now wrap around and support. Or they might say, we're just at a place in our church where we have discovered there's not really a need for that right now. Now what do we do? And we'd say, well, maybe the best place for you to start is right outside the walls of your church. Perhaps within existing constructs and relationships you already have. Maybe you're already partnered with a local school. You're already providing services for them up the road. Well, we know schools become one of the most frontline players in this whole thing. I mean, they know who the families are in their schools that are the most at risk and vulnerable. They know who these kids are. They have a history with them. Or maybe we're already partnered with a local organization that's providing a certain service to our community, and they know who the families are, and they know where the needs are. And we're able to step right outside the walls of our church, but still within existing relationships that we already have, where there's trust that's built, there's relational equity. Or maybe a church says, I don't know if we even have any of that. Then we'd say, well, then maybe you begin to just call other churches in your community and say, hey, what are you guys doing? We'd love to learn from you. We've heard that you guys are doing something. Or you contact a local agency, and you don't tell them what you want to do for them. You say, hey, can we come sit with you and just listen to you and learn from you what your biggest needs are? If a church were to get involved with what you're doing, what would you need that church to do? A lot of times, with good intention, we might come to the table and tell people what we want to do for them, when really the best thing we can do is come to the table and say, teach us. We want to learn from you. How can we best serve you? And then start there.
No, that's super good. I think the churches that we have the opportunities to work with that have done this for a really long time and done it in a very sustainable and kind of holistic type of way are the churches who are really ready to like listen and learn, not only to their own people, right, within the context of their church and families, but also to the community at large to say, hey, where can we step in and serve and help? One question as you're kind of talking through this of like where to start, if there's a church leader out there that says like, okay, what kind of timeline are we looking at, right? Like, and I know it might look different from church to church, but typically, like, what are we looking at? Are we looking at like a 2-month process? Are we looking at a year-long process to roll out and do some of these things? What can that look like?
That's really good. Every time I'm asked that or something along the lines of that, I'm reminded of something that a guy that I work for reminds our team of often, which is this: when we're involved in the deep work of justice and mercy, results at times are going to feel slow and underwhelming. when we are involved in maybe some of the lower hanging fruit opportunities, like how many backpacks can we collect,
Right.
or a food, a canned food drive, or in not negating the importance and the time and place for some of those things, just simply these are different things. Results at times can feel fast and overwhelming. Like, look, in 3 months we collected, 5,000 canned goods, and
Right.
now we get to donate them, and that's great. There's a time and place for that. Largely, what we're involved in is this deep, slow, long work of justice and mercy, and so setting expectations for the church leaders, who are then setting expectations for people within the church. Hey, this isn't a microwave, right? This is going to feel slow and long and underwhelming at times.
Yeah.
But that's okay, because we're in it for the long haul in the deep work of justice and mercy and relationships and transformation. So I think that's just a good umbrella to set expectations, so that when people begin to feel like this just feels slow and it's underwhelming, go, yeah. Remember, that's what we signed up for,
Yeah.
That's not a bad thing. It can be a good thing. Doesn't mean we don't work hard. So I think it's going to be different. The thing with this is there's no script, there's no recipe for every church. There's a number of ingredients, but each church kind of takes those ingredients and creates a little bit of their own recipe, ingredients being like, hey, we want to support families in our church really, really well. We want to have really good trust-based relationships with local organizations and agencies. The best way we do that is by asking questions, listening, and learning.
Yeah.
There's ingredients, but there's no script, there's no recipe. So I would say, to the extent that there are good local partners, and even the role of Riverside Project is we actually exist in part to help connect you to the people you need to be connected to.
Right.
And it likely gets the ball moving down the field a little faster. It takes some of the guesswork out. But I would say there are certain things that you can begin to do immediately, pretty quickly, that are service-oriented. But when a church gets to a point where we are going to begin to really call our people to engage in some long, hard ways that potentially affect their lives in perpetuity forever, like opening your home to a child, for example. We really want to lay the groundwork for a long, long time before we do that. A very good friend of mine, he's become just a mentor of mine. He's a pastor in Orlando, an adoptive father. Very dynamic guy, very open about some of their struggles, has led his church incredibly well through this, and also speaks with the South African accent. So everything he says is just like, oh, talk more. You can talk to me about algebra. I don't care, right? It just is so soothing. But he and I were doing a workshop not long ago on even preaching about this from the pulpit. How do you preach on the gospel and this? And someone in the afterwards said, hey, how do I know when it's the right time to preach a sermon
that's a good question.
calls my people into those exceptionally hard places? Right. And he said, it's the right time after you've preached 20 or 30 or 40 sermons on the gospel. And I don't think he's being literal, like, plan a 40-week sermon series on the gospel, and then you can do. I think his point was, you lay down and press in over time consistently a deeply embedded culture of the gospel in your church that begins to flip the narratives, flip the assumptions, flipping the assumption from, well, my answer is no, I won't do hard things until I hear a yes from God, do hard things, to actually, no, the assumption now is yes. Yes. Unless I hear a no. Like, that's a whole different framework, right? Press it deeply, and then when we have opportunity to invite our people to engage in some particularly difficult places, our hope is that after 20, 30, 40 sermons on the gospel, they're almost, he would say, like sitting on the edge of their seat, just waiting for, like, okay, when do we do it? When?
Yeah.
Like, and now it's, hey, some of you need to open your home and invite, and like, the assumption's yes.
Yeah.
Right. Like, yeah, that's what we do. So we're in this for the long haul.
Yeah.
And from the pulpit down to the on-the-ground relationships, there's some immediate things you can do that stand ready, organizations you can partner with, families in your church you can rally around and learn from, all with kind of the long view in mind.
Yeah, no, I think that's so good. I mean, so much. I remember sitting in the church that are training even through Riverside Project as a church staff member, 4 or 5 years ago now, hearing the concept of the river, a lot of the things that you're even sharing, and leaving like kind of like, oh, my mind is blown, because it's paradigm shifting. To say I actually am leaving with less to do and more to think about and more to consider. And ultimately, like that, I think drives kind of what you're talking about, this gospel-centric, discipleship-driven movement through our people that says, hey, it's not about plugging in right now, though there could be, like as you're saying, avenues to do that, but it's actually, and you say this like very articulately in all of your trainings and things like this, but that, hey, we want to be the type of people that do hard things and move towards difficult and broken places. And so it's good.
And that takes time. We're talking, like you said, discipleship, identity. Many people, just the average person, frankly, in our churches, they look around and go, well, I've got a job, a mortgage, some friends or some kids or this and that, and I just don't know if I'm the kind of person that could actually do. And when I hear that, I hear identity.
Right.
It's and so much of what discipleship is, I know this sounds corny, but Jesus said it, so it's not that corny. The idea of you're going to go from fishermen to fishers of men, like that's an identity shift. And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about. Do I see myself as the kind of person that does this? Well, no, frankly, I don't. Or that can make a difference or engage in ways that are potentially uncomfortable, out of my control.
Right.
And that's a lot of the work that we're doing in discipleship, and that takes time. It takes time.
So talk to me about the individual who says, hey, I'm this passionate individual, I'm driven and burdened about this space, but it doesn't seem like my church is on board or my pastor is on board. Talk to me kind of about, hey, what does it look like for that person to engage? Or even like, you worked with many churches across the country to say, hey, there's a difference, right, between a church that their pastor is preaching it from stage and the individual who's saying, I'm just really passionate about it and I'm trying to get my small group involved. What does that look like?
Yeah. The first thing I would say to that passionate person is that passion probably for them is coming from a place of experience that the majority of people in their church don't have.
Yeah.
And so we have to be really fair and cognizant of the fact that I've experienced something, I've walked through something, I'm aware of something that a lot of people around me aren't, and it's unfair expectation on my part.
Yeah, that's really good.
To want them to be as passionate about it as I am.
Do you find, sorry to cut you off, but do you find that like, is that person like typically a foster parent or they babysat or something like that?
It's typically someone that's fostered or adopted, or they've been deeply involved in upstream work, working with people in crisis. Maybe it's crisis pregnancy or it's young parents in crisis, and they've lived, breathed, eat, bled, sweat, cried that world for a long time.
Yeah.
And they're very well versed in that world, very aware of that world, and they look up and around their church, and if we're not careful, rather than having a posture of I want to help other people around me become aware of this, sometimes we can look around at people in our church with a spirit of indictment, like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you care as much about this as I do? And so I think it's just really, really helpful for us to understand that dynamic is always at play. It's what makes kindergarten teachers good kindergarten teachers, and why I could never be a kindergarten teacher. Because you have to just be patient and sweet and kind to a kid that doesn't understand 1 + 1 = 2.
Yeah.
And it's like 1 + 1 = 2, kid. Okay. hey kid, what does 1 + 1 equal? 4. Like, what's wrong with you? Like, why is this so hard, right? That's why I'm not a kindergarten teacher.
Yeah.
She has to be super sweet and
Yeah.
patient, you know? And that's the posture we have to have is 1 + 1 for us clearly equals 2. We've seen it. We've lived it probably in our home. It's affected our lives. It's flipped us upside down. We can't assume that other people see the equation the way that we do, including our pastors, including our church leaders. We have to have a level of empathy and understanding that they have a million things coming at them all the time, and are charged with the task of being good shepherds, filters that are stewarding well the things that are getting into the church and into the life and the culture of the church, and the things that are not. And so they're constantly bombarded with a lot. And so just really great examples I've seen of churches, of passionate individuals in churches. One always comes to mind. It's actually a church in Las Vegas. And the way that she tells the story of how their church got involved was simply this. Foster mom recognized the desperate need for support and community she had, started a support group in her home.
Yeah.
That group kept growing. They moved to a different home, outgrew that home. They exhausted all their options, went to the church and said, hey, this has been happening. We've outgrown homes. Is there any way that we can use space at the church? Yeah. Now, they've been members of this church for a long time. They had trust, credibility, but the church itself wasn't really involved. And it was just a simple ask. Is there any way we can use space at the church? And the church said, yeah, sure. So they gave them space at the church. They started to outgrow that. People from the community started to come. That brought in a whole aspect of we need to be able to support other people in our community. And it just kind of continued. Simple ask turned into the next simple ask, turned into the next simple ask. And it was just kind of a groundswell within church culture and church leadership. And we see that happening over and over again. It was not foster mom starts a support group grows, while mom simultaneously grows in her anger and angst towards church leadership for not caring about this. It's like, no, it's not that they don't care. It's just that they don't necessarily know how. And no one better to help them know how than you, right? And so what she didn't do was go in blazing hot to the pastor's office, mad, you know, that our church doesn't care. No, it was, here's what we've been doing. Here's our simple ask. And we see that happening and working all over the place. And I think church leaders go, thank you for being helpful. I've never met a church leader that says, Jason, we are adamantly and aggressively committed to not caring about vulnerable children and families. Right? Of course not. It's always, of course, we just don't know how. And so no better people to help church leaders know how than those who have been involved in it. And then, you know, we'll hear folks say, how can I get my church leader on board? Well, we've just kind of unpacked some of that. But the assumption is if we can just get more stage time, you know, preach about it more, top down. And I'll say to a lot of people, I'll say, actually, I don't think your pastor's ready to talk about this from stage. We want the right words in the right way. Or, and actually, if they did, right now, it would create more problems than it would solve. Or, no, your pastor is very well versed in this, could really articulate it well, but it's still not time. Because the infrastructure to support anything that's said from stage is not in place yet. And so we want the right words at the right time in the right way to the church, but we also want the infrastructure in place to support it. And until those two things are ready, then it's just not time.
No, I think that's good. So oftentimes the churches that we are connected to here in the city, and this is coming from churches, not even, I was about to say what we find, but really a big thing that comes from church leaders is saying, hey, I struggle with, or the biggest challenge that we face as a ministry or as a church that's trying to operate in this space is the whole like age-old concept, right? It's 20% of the people doing 80% of the work, and I just can't get anyone on board to meet needs through Response Network, or I can't get anybody on board to show up to serve agency workers or whatever. And so talk to me about just team building in general, and how have you seen that work in certain churches? Maybe what are some of the steps to consider when it comes to just developing a team and mobilizing people around this idea of caring?
Yeah, that's good. This may be a bit jarring, but I mean it in like the most gracious, loving, tender way that I possibly can. A lot of times, the person who is most passionate about this ends up being the person that should not lead it. And that's not the case every time, but there is an element of self-awareness as early on as possible. I remember this in my church planting days, that, whoa, it may have taken a personality like me or a guy with a certain gift set like me to start this thing, but it got to a point very quickly where it's going to take a whole different skill set to actually lead this thing long term. So I just say that on the very front end so that it's not so shocking when leaders within churches are confronted with that reality. And just be prepared for that and begin to build towards that now. So to the extent that you can gather people around you that have different skill sets, different gifts, and they don't even necessarily have to be people that are also foster parents or are also adoptive parents or are also involved in the particular thing you're involved in. Sometimes the best people to have around the table are people that have a unique set of skills that they look at and go, this is my day job. My day job is Excel spreadsheets, and I love it. I'm a data person. How in the world could I ever use that for like ministry or serving, right? And maybe you're giving them a gift by saying, actually, there's a place for you at the table. And they go, wow, what a really cool opportunity. So be thinking along those lines, think outside the box a little bit. And also just be thinking through what barriers might be in place that are getting the results that you're getting. I can't get anyone to like come serve with us, or I can't get anyone to meet a need on the Response Network. Well, and again, I know this sounds so, I'm trying to be really gentle here, but we find it's often not that the problem is with the people that are being asked. The problem is with how they're being asked. The means by which they're being asked. And maybe the person that's doing the asking doesn't need to be the person that's doing the asking. So there's a lot of dynamics there. The big principle for any church is what we have found historically, doesn't matter what kind of church, what size of church, is the number one cause for a ministry that's focused on this within a local church to eventually fizzle out and die is lack of leadership, sustainable leadership. And so that can mean one person or couple has been leading it forever, and then there's a job change and they have to move, and then the ministry just crumbles. Or they get burned out and they have to just step back. So building out a team that's sustainable and growing in your capacity to put the right people in the right places is important, so that if one has to roll out, they move because of a job or family circumstances, wow, big loss, but we're still okay. We're still okay. And then a question that's often associated with this is, do our pastors need to be involved? Like, to what extent does church leadership on staff versus volunteer? And generally speaking, the lead pastors aren't really going to be the ones leading this necessarily. And it probably shouldn't be like that. I think a lot of pastors we work with actually find great joy in seeing people within the congregation leading out ministry areas. But it's always and often a good idea to have some kind of connection to the staff. And I know that it varies from church to church. It could be a small church with one staff member.
Right.
It could be a large church, and maybe our staff liaison is the small groups pastor or the missions pastor. But having a connector who's able to kind of be the liaison between the ministry on the ground and the leadership at the top is always a wise thing.
Right.
To have in place as well.
Yeah, that's good. One last question on team building here. It's because it sounds like what you're saying in large part is, hey, the perfect place to start with team building is to actually ask, hey, are we communicating effectively, and are we communicating clearly?
Mm-hmm.
One quote that you share often that I heard for the first time years ago when you shared it from Chip and Dan Heath was that resistance quote, right? And so I don't know if you'd be willing to share that, but then also like kind of defining, hey, what does it look like to have a ministry that has clarity around it so that it's communicated well and effectively?
Yeah, they say in their book, I think their book Switch, they say sometimes what feels like resistance is often just a lack of clarity. And that goes back to, hey, it's not that we're resistant, it's not that we're against this, it's just we don't know how.
Yeah.
And again, it's often the case that the most passionate advocate that's lived, breathed, sweat, cried, died on this thing, right?
Yeah.
Communicates with passion and cause and not a lot of clarity on how. God cares about kids and there's a lot out there and you should care, and they're going, yeah, but how, right? And why even? I think creating a really compelling invitation into why are we meeting needs through Response Network? Just so people have a couch or stuff they need? Well, that's unbelievably important. But the bigger why is because it has the capacity to introduce us into life-changing relationships in ways that maybe we otherwise would have never been able to be introduced to. That's why we're doing what we're doing. And of course, to meet the tangible needs of people. So we've in other places talked about the importance of just sustainability over speed.
Yeah.
And this is an area in which, hey, one of the ways for us to build long-term sustainability is to slow down long enough and figure out, as a leader, as a leadership team, who needs to be a part of this? How are we going to talk about this?
Yeah.
How are we going to invite other people into this? What language are we going to use? What's our why driving this? What very practical steps are we going to have in place to increase clarity? Like it's abundant. It's so easy to get involved in whatever it is that we're inviting you to. So we've removed barriers, we've increased clarity, and we're inviting people into something that's deeply meaningful.
Yeah.
And then we just continue to lean into it and ask God to be all over it. And what we see often is that there are so many people around us who say, I want my life to count. I want my life to make a difference for something. When I look out at the world, though, I just don't even know where to start. I just don't know how. And you have an opportunity as a leader within your church to create a space that's a real gift for people. You say, I want my life to count for something. I just don't know how to get involved. But thank God that you guys came along and began to present some opportunities, because now I know how. Now I know some things that I can do.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Thanks.
Yeah.
That's good.